They told us Britain was starving. Someone whispered behind him. But General Klaus Reinhardt did not turn his head as the steel ramp dropped with a hollow clang against the dock, and the cold Atlantic air moved in, thick and damp, carrying a smell he did not expect. Not smoke, not ruin, but salt and something faintly warm, like bread, like life continuing somewhere beyond sight. And for a moment he remained inside the shadow of the transport ship, boots still on iron, unwilling to take the final step because everything he had been taught demanded that what waited outside would confirm it, that Britain would look broken, exhausted, barely standing, a nation drained by years of war, and yet the silence that greeted them was wrong. Too steady, too calm, no shouting, no chaos, just the low hum of machinery and distant voices moving in rhythm. And when the first line of prisoners began to descend, he followed, slowly, each step measured, controlled, his posture still that of a man who had once commanded divisions. But as he reached the edge of the ramp and the light opened before him, something inside him hesitated, not fear, not exactly, but resistance, like a thought refusing to form, because what he saw did not match anything he had prepared himself to see. The dock stretched wide and intact, wooden planks dry and solid under the gray morning sky. Cranes moved with deliberate precision, lifting cargo from ships that showed no signs of damage. Workers in plain clothes walked back and forth carrying crates, talking, even laughing in brief, quiet bursts. And no one looked at the prisoners with hatred, no one stared, no one pointed. It was as if their arrival was just another task in a long list of ordinary things. And that was the first fracture, small but undeniable, because war was not supposed to look ordinary. Not here, not after everything he had believed. And then his eyes caught something smaller, almost insignificant, a man standing near a stack of crates holding a cup in his hand, steam rising gently into the cool air, and the man lifted it, took a slow sip, and continued watching the movement of cargo like nothing in the world had changed, like there was no urgency, no desperation, and Klaus blinked once, then again, not out of confusion but because his mind needed time to adjust to what his eyes were insisting on showing him. And behind him boots continued to hit the ramp in steady rhythm, the sound echoing against metal and wood. But even that rhythm felt different now, less like the march of defeated men and more like something quieter, something unresolved. And as he stepped forward onto the dock, the sensation beneath his feet was solid, real, not the broken ground he had imagined. And a British officer passed in front of him, close enough that Klaus could see the lines of fatigue in his face, the slight stiffness in his shoulders. But there was no hostility in his expression, only focus. The officer held a clipboard, marking names, checking numbers, his voice low, and even as he spoke to another soldier. And when a German officer further down the line stumbled slightly on the edge of the ramp, a British soldier reached out without hesitation, steadying him with a firm but careful grip, then releasing him just as quickly. No words exchanged, no acknowledgement beyond the act itself. And Klaus felt that second fracture, deeper now, because kindness, even in its smallest form, was not something he had expected to witness here, not directed at them, not in this place. And he found himself standing still for a fraction too long, just long enough for the line behind him to shift, for a guard to glance in his direction, not sharply, not impatiently, just a brief look, as if to remind him to keep moving. And so he did, one step, then another, but his attention kept drifting, pulled by details he could not ignore, the sound of a distant bell marking the hour, the steady creak of ropes as ships were secured, the faint hum of a truck engine idling nearby. Everything working, everything functioning, everything intact, and the realization did not come as a single thought, but as a slow, creeping awareness that something fundamental had been wrong, not just in detail, but in scale, in understanding, in the entire picture he had carried with him across the sea. And as he moved further onto the dock, blending into the line of gray uniforms under a sky that showed no sign of collapse, he felt the weight of that awareness settle, quiet but heavy, because if Britain looked like this, if this was reality, then the war he thought he understood had been something else entirely, something incomplete, something distorted. And for the first time since he had stepped onto the ship days ago, General Klaus Reinhardt did not think about strategy or command or defeat. He thought about a single, simple question that had no immediate answer, and the question stayed with him as he walked forward into a country that did not match the story he had believed. And the more he looked, the less certain he became that any part of that story had been true at all. The line moved forward without urgency, and that was the second thing that felt wrong, because defeat was supposed to be loud, disordered, filled with sharp commands and restless motion. But here it unfolded at the pace of a workday, steady, almost routine, and Klaus Reinhardt adjusted his coat slightly as the wind shifted off the water, cool against his face, carrying with it the distant sound of a bell and the low murmur of voices that did not rise above necessity. And he noticed how the British soldiers stood, not rigid, not aggressive, but present, watchful without tension, their rifles resting naturally, not aimed, not used as symbols of dominance, just tools carried as part of their duty. And one of them walked alongside the line, glancing at faces, at uniforms, at boots, as if confirming details rather than measuring threat. And when his eyes met Klaus for a brief second, there was no flicker of recognition, no trace of hostility. Only acknowledgement, the kind one might give a stranger passing on a street. And that absence lingered longer than any insult could have, because it removed something Klaus had expected to feel, something that would have made sense. And in its place was a quiet neutrality that offered no resistance, no explanation, just space. And as they were guided toward a waiting transport truck, he noticed the vehicle itself, clean, functional, the paint intact, tires firm, no signs of strain or scarcity. And a driver sat inside with one arm resting on the window frame, looking out at the dock with an expression that suggested patience rather than fatigue. And the prisoners climbed in one by one, boots striking metal in a rhythm that echoed softly, and Klaus stepped up last among his group, turning slightly as he did, his gaze pulled back toward the harbor where ships moved slowly across the gray water, their silhouettes steady and whole. And he realized he had been expecting something else entirely, some visible mark of collapse, something that would confirm that the strain of years had left its imprint. But there was none, not here, not in what he could see. And as the truck door closed behind them with a dull, solid sound, the engine started with a smooth, unforced hum. And they began to move, rolling away from the dock, at a measured pace, passing rows of warehouses that stood upright and maintained, their windows intact, their doors open to activity. And people moved in and out carrying goods, exchanging brief words, continuing tasks that seemed uninterrupted by the presence of war. And Klaus sat on the wooden bench inside the truck, hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture still composed, but his attention sharper now, drawn outward, absorbing details he could not dismiss. A woman walking along the edge of the street carrying a basket, her pace unhurried, her expression neutral. A boy standing near a doorway watching the truck pass, not with fear, not with curiosity, just watching, and then turning away as if there was nothing remarkable to see. And that indifference pressed in more than anything else, because it suggested a world that did not revolve around conflict, a world that continued regardless of it. And the truck turned onto a wider road, tires rolling over smooth pavement, and the city began to open around them, buildings rising in orderly rows, brick and stone, some showing signs of wear but none reduced to ruin. And the sky above remained steady, a pale gray that reflected off windows and rooftops. And Klaus felt something shift again, not sudden, not dramatic, but cumulative, like layers being removed one at a time, revealing something he had not prepared to confront. And across from him another officer adjusted his cap, his movements slow, deliberate, as if conserving energy. And for a moment their eyes met, a silent exchange passing between them, not of words, but of recognition, that what they were seeing was shared, that the absence of destruction was not an illusion, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that would fit within the structure of what they had known. And the truck slowed briefly at an intersection where a man in uniform raised a hand, directing traffic with calm precision, and nearby a small shop stood open, its windows displaying items arranged neatly, ordinary objects that belonged to a life not defined by scarcity. And a woman stepped out holding a wrapped parcel, pausing to adjust her coat before continuing on her way. And the scene held no tension, no urgency, only continuity. And as the truck moved again, Klaus leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed beyond the passing streets, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had believed, and the effort itself felt unfamiliar, because it required him to question not a single detail, but the foundation beneath it, and he realized that the war had not ended in the way he had imagined, not in the clear lines of victory and collapse, but in something far more complex, something that left room for a reality that did not align with expectation. And as they drove deeper into the city, the sound of the engine steady beneath him, the rhythm of movement constant, he felt the first quiet sense that understanding would not come quickly, that it would require more than observation, more than a single moment, and that whatever truth existed here would reveal itself slowly, in pieces, in the same measured way this place seemed to operate. And for the first time since stepping onto the dock, he did not search for confirmation, he simply watched. And in that watching, something within him began to change. Not in conclusion, but in direction, turning away from certainty and towards something he could not yet name. The truck slowed as it turned through a pair of open gates, and what waited beyond was not what Klaus Reinhardt had expected from a place meant to hold men like him. The buildings were arranged in clean lines, low structures made of wood and brick, their paint worn but maintained, windows intact, glass reflecting the gray sky. And there was space between them, not crowded, not oppressive, just ordered, deliberate, as if the place had been built with function in mind rather than control. And the truck rolled to a stop on a gravel path where the sound of tires softened into a steady crunch, and no one shouted for them to move. No one barked commands. Instead, a British officer stepped forward, the same one Klaus had seen earlier on the dock, Captain Edward Collins, his coat buttoned neatly, his cap set straight, and he held the same clipboard in his hand, flipping a page with a small, practiced motion before looking up, his eyes moving across the group not as a judge, but as someone verifying a list. And when he spoke, his voice carried just enough to be heard, calm, measured, without strain, instructing them to disembark one at a time. And the soldiers beside him stood in position, not blocking, not pressing forward, simply present. And Klaus stepped down from the truck, boots meeting gravel with a muted sound, and he noticed immediately the absence of urgency again, the lack of tension in the air, as if time here moved at its own pace, unaffected by what had come before. And as the line formed naturally without force, Collins walked along it, checking names, pausing briefly at each man, sometimes asking a question in clear, careful German, sometimes only marking the paper, and moving on. And when he reached Klaus, he stopped for a fraction longer, not because of rank, not because of recognition, but because something in Klaus's posture still held the remnants of command, and Collins met his gaze directly, not with challenge, not with sympathy, just acknowledgement. And in that moment Klaus understood something subtle but unmistakable, that whatever authority he had once carried no longer held weight here, and yet he was not diminished by it, not reduced, only redefined. And Collins made a small mark on the page and moved on without comment. And the line continued forward toward a low building where the door stood open, and inside there was light, not harsh, not glaring, but steady, revealing a space that was clean, organized, tables arranged in rows, papers stacked neatly, a clock on the wall marking the hour with a soft ticking sound that seemed louder than it should have been. And as Klaus stepped inside, the change in air was immediate, warmer, carrying the faint scent of soap and wood, and he paused just long enough to register it before moving forward again, guided not by force but by the quiet flow of those ahead of him. And a British clerk sat behind a table, glasses resting low on his nose, his expression focused but not severe, and he gestured for Klaus to step closer, speaking in German with a careful accent, asking for his name, his rank, his place of birth, and Klaus answered, each word precise, controlled, the habit of clarity still intact, and the clerk wrote each detail with steady handwriting, nodding once before sliding a paper across the table and indicating where to stand next. And there was no interrogation, no probing, only process, efficient and unembellished. And as Klaus moved aside, he watched the others pass through the same sequence, each man treated with the same measured attention, no variation, no deviation. And beyond the tables another door stood open, leading to a corridor where footsteps echoed softly against the floor, and through that corridor they were directed into a barracks, long and simple. Rows of metal-framed beds lined evenly along the walls, each one made with folded blankets and a pillow placed at the head, and Klaus slowed again. Not out of hesitation, but because the sight required a moment to understand. Beds, prepared, waiting, not temporary arrangements, not improvised, but intentional. And a man near him let out a quiet breath, not quite a sound, more a release, and Klaus walked to one of the empty beds, placing his hand lightly on the frame, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers, solid, real, and he sat down slowly, the mattress giving slightly under his weight, and for a moment he did nothing else, just sat, his gaze fixed ahead, taking in the space, the order, the absence of what he had expected. And outside he could hear movement, footsteps, voices, the continued rhythm of the camp functioning without disruption. And somewhere a door closed with a soft click, and the clock from the other room continued its steady ticking, marking time that did not feel heavy or urgent, just passing. And Klaus leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, and the thought that had begun on the dock returned, not as a question now, but as a quiet realization forming in pieces that what he was seeing was not an exception, not a moment staged for effect, but a system, consistent, deliberate, built on something he had not accounted for. And as he sat there in that barracks, surrounded by men who shared the same silence, he understood that the war had not only been fought on fields and in cities, but also in the stories that shaped what each side believed about the other. And here, in this place, those stories were beginning to fall apart, not through argument, not through force, but through the simple, undeniable weight of reality that required nothing from him except to be seen. Morning arrived without announcement, and that was the first thing Klaus Reinhardt noticed as his eyes opened to a ceiling that did not press down on him, but simply existed above. Plain wood beams crossing in quiet order, and light entered through the windows in thin gray lines, soft and steady, not harsh, not interrupted, just present. And for a moment he remained still, listening, because he expected something to follow, a whistle, a command, a signal that would define the beginning of the day. But there was nothing like that, only the distant sound of footsteps outside, measured, unhurried, and the faint clink of metal from somewhere beyond the barracks. And as he sat up, the bed beneath him shifted slightly, the mattress responding in a way that felt unfamiliar after months of harder surfaces. And he placed his feet on the floor, the wood cool under his boots, grounding, real, and around him the other men were waking in the same quiet way, no rush, no tension, just movement, each man adjusting, standing, smoothing his uniform, as if maintaining some remnant of structure that no longer served a clear purpose. And Klaus stood as well, his posture instinctively straight, though there was no one here to command or to observe, and he moved toward the window, his steps slow, deliberate, and outside he saw the camp already in motion, not with urgency, but with continuity, soldiers walking along paths, carrying out tasks that did not seem driven by pressure, but by routine. And beyond the fence, farther than he had expected to see, there were trees, bare branches reaching into the gray sky, and beyond them, something else, rooftops, distant, orderly, suggesting a world that existed beyond this place, unaffected. And he watched for a moment longer before turning back, and as he did, a British soldier appeared in the doorway, pausing just inside, not stepping forward, not raising his voice, only speaking clearly enough to be heard, informing them that breakfast was ready. And the word itself lingered for a second in Klaus's mind, not because of its meaning, but because of the tone in which it was delivered, as information, not instruction. And the men began to move, forming a loose line without being told, guided by something internal rather than imposed. And Klaus followed, stepping out into the cool morning air, the gravel beneath his boots shifting softly with each step, and the path led them toward a long building where the door stood open, and inside the space was already active, tables arranged in rows, trays set out in order, and behind a counter British personnel moved with quiet efficiency, placing items, arranging portions, and the line progressed steadily. No pushing, no delay, and when Klaus reached the counter he was handed a tray, the metal warm from contact, and he looked down at what had been placed upon it. Bread, real bread, not thin, not rationed to the point of absence, a portion of eggs, steam still rising faintly, and a cup filled with something dark. The scent of coffee unmistakable, and he did not react immediately, not outwardly, but his hand paused for a fraction longer than necessary before moving on, and he took a seat at one of the tables. The wood surface smoothed beneath his fingers as he set the tray down, and around him the room filled with the quiet sounds of eating, utensils against metal, low voices, and he picked up the cup first, bringing it closer, the warmth reaching his hands, and he inhaled slightly, the scent stronger now, familiar and yet distant, and he took a small sip, the taste settling. Slowly, not sharp, not diluted, just present, and he set the cup down carefully, his movements controlled, and then he reached for the bread, breaking it with steady hands, and the texture, the simple fact of it, required no explanation, and across from him another officer sat, his expression composed but altered, as if he too was registering something he had not prepared for, and their eyes met briefly, not in conversation, but in acknowledgement, and no words were exchanged because none were needed, and Klaus lowered his gaze back to the tray, continuing to eat, each motion deliberate, each detail noted without commentary, and as the minutes passed the room maintained its rhythm, no interruption, no escalation, just continuity, and at the far end Captain Edward Collins stood near the entrance, observing not with scrutiny, but with awareness, his presence. Steady, and when a man near the door hesitated, uncertain where to go next, Collins stepped forward, speaking quietly, guiding him with a gesture rather than a command, and the man moved on without confusion, and Klaus watched this from a distance, not openly, but enough to understand that what he was witnessing was not accidental, not inconsistent, but part of a structure that operated without force. And that realization settled slowly, like the light filtering through the windows, not overwhelming, but persistent, and as he finished the last of the meal he placed the utensils back on the tray with care, the small sound of metal against metal marking the end of something that felt larger than the act itself, and he remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because he was beginning to understand that each of these moments, each small detail, was not isolated, but connected, forming a pattern that could not be dismissed, and as he finally stood and carried the tray toward the designated area, placing it down as instructed by a simple sign rather than a voice, he realized that whatever this place represented, it was not what he had been prepared to encounter, and that understanding did not arrive as a conclusion, but as a shift, quiet, undeniable, and still unfolding. The rest of the day unfolded without interruption, and that absence became its own presence, something Klaus Reinhardt could not ignore as he stepped out of the mess hall into the open air again, the sky unchanged, a uniform gray stretching above the camp, and the wind moved lightly across the yard carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant smoke, not the heavy kind that marked destruction, but something smaller, contained, like a fire used for warmth or work, and he walked without being directed, following the natural flow of movement as other men dispersed across the grounds, some toward designated work areas, others toward administrative buildings. Each step guided not by command, but by quiet expectation, and he noticed how the British soldiers positioned themselves, not in rigid lines, not forming barriers, but spaced evenly, visible, accessible, their presence enough to define the structure without enforcing it. And near the center of the yard a small group of prisoners had gathered around a wooden table where tools were laid out. Simple implements, hammers, nails, measuring lines, and a British corporal stood with them, demonstrating something with slow, deliberate motions, his hands steady, his voice low, explaining rather than instructing, and the men watched, some nodding slightly, others adjusting their stance as if preparing to try the same movement, and Klaus paused at a distance, observing, because this too did not align with what he had expected. The idea that work would begin not with orders, but with explanation, and that participation would follow not from pressure but from understanding. And he remained there for a moment longer before continuing on, his path taking him along the edge of the camp, where the fence marked a boundary that felt less imposing than he had imagined, its structure clear, its purpose obvious, but beyond it the land stretched outward, open fields fading into lines of trees, and beyond those trees the faint outline of buildings suggested a town. a place where life continued without direct connection to this one, and the separation between the two did not feel like isolation but distinction, as if both could exist without interfering with the other. And he stopped near the fence, his hands resting lightly behind his back, his gaze fixed outward, and for the first time since arriving he allowed himself to consider not just what he was seeing but what it meant, not in terms of strategy or outcome, but in terms of understanding. And the question that had followed him since the doc returned again. Clearer now, more defined, not as a challenge but as a quiet inquiry into the nature of what had been true and what had only been believed. And he stood there until a voice behind him spoke his name, not sharply, not with urgency, but clearly enough to reach him. And he turned to see Captain Edward Collins approaching, his steps even, his posture unchanged, and when he stopped a few feet away he did not stand over Klaus, did not create distance through authority, but met him at eye level, holding the same composed expression that had marked every interaction so far. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty but measured, and then Collins spoke in careful German, his tone consistent, informing Klaus of the schedule for the day, the expectations, the structure that would guide their time here. And there was no threat in his words, no emphasis beyond clarity, just information delivered with precision. And Klaus listened, his attention focused, not because he was being compelled to listen, but because the consistency of what he had experienced demanded it. And when Collins finished he paused, as if allowing space for a response, and Klaus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the information without embellishment. And Collins returned the gesture with the smallest of nods before stepping back, turning, and continuing on his way, his presence moving through the camp without disruption. And Klaus remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as the officer disappeared among the buildings. And something settled then, not a conclusion, not an acceptance, but a recognition that what he was witnessing was not an exception to the rule, but the rule itself. And that whatever understanding he had carried with him was no longer sufficient to explain it. And as he turned away from the fence and walked back toward the center of the camp, his steps steady, his posture unchanged, he felt that shift deepen, not visible, not spoken, but present. And in that presence there was a new awareness, one that did not resolve the questions before him, but allowed them to exist without immediate answer. And that, more than anything else, marked the difference between what he had believed and what he was now beginning to see. A difference that would not be bridged in a single moment, but would unfold over time, in small details, in quiet observations, in the steady rhythm of a place that did not need to prove itself because it simply was. And as the day continued around him, unchanged, uninterrupted, Klaus Reinhardt understood that he had entered not just a different country, but a different reality. One that would require him to look again at everything he thought he knew, and to do so without resistance. Because resistance had no place here, only observation, and the slow, unavoidable recognition that followed it. By late afternoon the light began to change, not dramatically, not with the kind of sharp transition that marked urgency, but gradually, the gray softening into something warmer at the edges, and Klaus Reinhardt found himself once again moving without instruction, his path guided by observation rather than command, and the camp continued its steady rhythm, men working in small groups, voices low, movements deliberate, and the British soldiers remained present but unobtrusive, their attention spread evenly across the space, never fixed on a single point, never withdrawn. And Klaus noticed how this balance held, how it required no visible effort to maintain. And he paused near one of the work areas where a group of prisoners had been assigned to repair wooden crates, the tools arranged neatly on a table nearby. And a British corporal stood among them, not apart, not elevated, but within the group, demonstrating again how to align the boards, how to measure the spacing, his hands moving slowly, repeating the motion until it was clear. And one of the prisoners attempted the same action, his hands less steady, the angle slightly off. And the corporal did not correct him with words, did not raise his voice. He simply reached out, adjusted the position of the wood by a fraction of an inch, then stepped back, allowing the man to continue, and the correction was accepted without resistance, without embarrassment, as if it were part of the process rather than a judgment. And Klaus watched this for several seconds longer than necessary, because it revealed something he had not considered before, that authority could exist without pressure, that order could be maintained without force, and that realization did not come easily. It required him to let go of assumptions that had shaped his understanding for years, and he felt that process happening slowly, not as a decision, but as an adjustment, like the eyes adapting to a different light. And he turned away from the work area and continued walking, his steps carrying him toward the far side of the camp where the buildings gave way to open ground. And there he saw a small group gathered near a bench, not working, not waiting, simply sitting. And among them was Captain Edward Collins, his cap resting beside him, his posture relaxed but not informal. And he was speaking with one of the older prisoners, his voice low, his expression attentive, and the man responded in measured German, his hands moving slightly as he spoke, and there was no interruption, no sign of impatience, only listening, and Klaus slowed as he passed, not stopping, but close enough to observe without being observed, and he realized that this interaction was not exceptional, not something arranged, but natural, part of the same pattern he had been seeing all day, and that pattern now extended beyond tasks and structure into something more subtle, something that defined how people regarded one another within this place. And as he moved on, he felt the weight of that understanding settle more firmly, because it suggested that what he was witnessing was not temporary, not dependent on circumstance, but rooted in something deeper, something that could not be easily dismissed. And the air cooled slightly as the sun lowered behind the distant trees, the light shifting across the ground, stretching shadows longer, softening edges, and the camp responded to this change without disruption. The work continued at the same pace, the same rhythm, and Klaus found himself returning toward the barracks, not because he had been told to, but because the day itself seemed to guide that movement. And as he approached the building, he paused once more, looking back across the yard, taking in the arrangement, the movement, the absence of what he had expected to find. And he realized that the question that had followed him since his arrival was no longer the same question. It had changed, not in words, but in direction, no longer asking what had happened, but how it was possible that everything he saw could exist in contradiction to what he had believed. And he understood then that the answer would not be given to him directly, that it would not be explained in a single moment or a single conversation, but would emerge over time, through continued observation, through the accumulation of details that could not be ignored. And as he stepped inside the barracks, once again the air felt familiar now, the space no longer foreign, and he moved to his assigned bed, sitting down with the same measured control as before, but something in that control had shifted, less rigid, less defined by expectation, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together, and allowed the silence of the room to settle around him, not as emptiness, but as presence. And in that presence he felt the first clear recognition that what he was experiencing was not a moment of adjustment, but the beginning of something else entirely, something that would require him to reconsider not just what he had seen, but how he had chosen to see it. And that realization did not come with resistance. It came quietly, as everything here seemed to come, and remained, steady and undeniable, as the light outside faded, and the camp moved toward evening without a single raised voice. Without a single disruption, just the continuation of a rhythm that no longer felt unfamiliar, but inevitable. Evening settled without announcement, the light fading in a slow, almost unnoticeable shift until the sky outside the barracks turned from gray to a deeper shade that carried no urgency, no signal, only the passage of time. And Klaus Reinhardt remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his hands still resting together, his gaze unfocused, not because he was thinking of anything specific, but because the absence of pressure allowed space for something unfamiliar, and that space did not demand to be filled, it simply existed. And around him the other men moved quietly, some adjusting their coats, others lying back on their beds, their movements subdued, as if the rhythm of the place had already begun to shape them. And Klaus stood slowly, the motion controlled, habitual, but lighter now, less defined by purpose, and he walked toward the window again, drawn by the need to look outward, to confirm that what he had seen throughout the day had not changed with the fading light. And outside the camp continued its steady motion, lanterns placed at intervals casting soft pools of light along the paths, soldiers moving between buildings with the same measured pace, their voices low, their presence consistent, and beyond the fence the distant town showed small points of light as well, windows illuminated, suggesting lives continuing in parallel, untouched by the boundaries that defined this place. And Klaus watched for a moment as a figure walked along the road beyond the fence, a civilian, moving at an unhurried pace, hands in pockets, head slightly lowered against the evening air. And there was no indication that the camp held any particular significance to him. No glance toward the fence, no pause, just continuation. And that detail remained with Klaus longer than he expected, because it suggested something he had not considered before, that the existence of this place did not define the world around it, that it was contained, structured, but not central. And he turned slightly as a quiet sound came from behind him, the door opening just enough to allow Captain Edward Collins to step inside. His presence as consistent as it had been throughout the day, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, and he moved through the room without drawing attention, pausing briefly near one of the beds where an older prisoner sat, speaking a few words in low German, checking something that Klaus could not hear, and the man responded with a small nod, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and Collins placed a hand lightly on the edge of the bed, not in authority, not in control, but in reassurance. A gesture so subtle it could have been overlooked. And then he straightened and continued on, his steps measured, his movement part of the same quiet system that governed everything here, and Klaus followed him with his eyes until he reached the door again, stepping out into the dim light without interruption, and the room returned to its steady silence, the sound of breathing, the faint creak of wood, the distant hum of activity beyond the walls. And Klaus remained standing by the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, superimposed over the scene outside. And for a moment he looked at that reflection, not as a general, not as a figure defined by rank or command, but simply as a man placed within a context he did not yet fully understand. And that realization did not come with discomfort. It came with a quiet clarity, that whatever identity he had carried into this place was no longer sufficient to explain his surroundings, and that something else would be required. Something that had not been part of his experience before. And he turned away from the window, moving back toward his bed, sitting down once more, the motion now familiar, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes still open, following the lines of the ceiling as the light continued to fade, and the rhythm of the camp persisted, unchanged, uninterrupted. And in that persistence there was a kind of certainty, not about what would happen, but about how it would happen, steady, measured, without excess. And Klaus felt that certainty settle into him, not as acceptance, but as recognition, that this place operated according to principles he had not accounted for, and that those principles were not fragile, not temporary, but consistent. And as the room grew darker and the sounds around him softened further, he understood that the questions he carried would not be answered through confrontation or resistance, but through observation, through time, through the gradual accumulation of moments like this one, where nothing dramatic occurred, and yet everything changed. And he closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement. And when he opened them again the darkness had deepened, the outlines of the room softened, and the camp outside continued its quiet existence, unchanged, as if it had always been this way, and as if it would remain this way long after his understanding had caught up to it. And in that thought there was no urgency, only the steady awareness that whatever truth existed here would reveal itself, not because it was forced, but because it could not be hidden. And that realization stayed with him as the night settled fully, silent, complete, and entirely different from anything he had expected to find. Morning came again without announcement, but this time Klaus Reinhardt was already awake before the light fully reached the window, his eyes open in the dim gray just before dawn, listening. And the silence was not empty. It carried the same steady presence he had begun to recognize, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere outside, the soft rhythm of footsteps on gravel, the faint movement of air through the wooden frame of the barracks. And he remained still for a few seconds longer, not because he needed rest, but because he was aware now of the moment itself, aware of how different it felt from what he had known before, where each morning had begun with urgency, with expectation, with the immediate weight of decision. And here there was none of that, only continuity. And he sat up slowly, the motion controlled, familiar, but now accompanied by a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and as his feet touched the floor he noticed again the simple reality of it. Solid, steady, unchanged, and around him the others were beginning to move as well, their motions subdued, aligned, with the same rhythm, and no one spoke, not because they were forbidden to, but because there was no need, and Klaus stood and moved toward the window, drawn again to the outside, and the sky had shifted slightly, a lighter gray now, hinting at the coming day, and the camp was already active, soldiers moving along the paths, their figures defined by the soft morning light, and beyond the fence the distant rooftops were still, the town not yet fully awake, and for a moment he watched as a single figure walked along the road outside, a woman carrying something in her hands, her pace steady, her presence unremarkable, and that unremarkable quality held his attention, because it suggested a world that did not revolve around conflict, a world that existed independently of everything he had been part of, and he turned away from the window and prepared himself without hesitation, his movements efficient, but now lacking the tension that had once defined them. And when the door opened and a British soldier spoke quietly about breakfast, the words did not feel like instruction, they felt like continuation, and Klaus followed the others out into the cool morning air, the gravel beneath his boots familiar now, the path leading him toward the mess hall, without the need for direction. And as he entered the building, he noticed something he had not seen before, or perhaps had not allowed himself to see. The small details within the space, the way the tables were arranged with precision, the way the light entered through the windows at an angle that created soft shadows along the floor, the way the personnel behind the counter moved in coordination without speaking more than necessary. And he took his tray, the same as the day before, the same simple arrangement of food, and he sat at the same type of table, though not the same seat, and this time he did not pause before beginning to eat, not because the food had changed, but because his perception of it had. The act itself no longer carried the same weight of contradiction, it had become part of the pattern, and across the room Captain Edward Collins stood again near the entrance, his presence consistent, and this time Klaus noticed something different in the way he observed, not scanning, not measuring, but simply aware, as if his role was not to control but to maintain balance, and that distinction settled quietly in Klaus's mind, not as a conclusion but as an observation that fit with everything else he had seen, and as the meal continued the room remained steady, the same low sounds, the same measured pace, and Klaus found himself listening not for disruption but for consistency, and it was there in every movement, in every interaction, and when he finished and stood, carrying his tray to the designated area, he did so without hesitation, the action now understood without needing to be explained, and as he stepped back outside into the growing light of morning, he realized that the question he had carried with him had changed again, not in form, but in depth, no longer asking how this could be possible, but what it meant that it was, and that shift did not bring answers, but it brought clarity, a recognition that the truth he was beginning to see was not hidden, not obscured, but simply different from what he had expected, and as he walked across the yard, the air cool against his face, the sounds of the camp surrounding him in their steady rhythm, he understood that whatever he was learning here would not come from a single moment of realization, but from the accumulation of moments like this one, where nothing dramatic occurred, and yet everything continued to change, and in that continuation there was something he could not ignore, something that required him to keep looking, to keep observing, because the more he saw, the less he could return to what he had believed before, and that understanding remained with him as the day began again, quiet, consistent, and entirely unchanged in a way that made all the difference. The morning extended into midday with the same quiet consistency, and Klaus Reinhardt began to notice something he had not allowed himself to notice before, not just the structure of the place, but the way people moved within it, the absence of tension not as a lack of control, but as a different kind of control, one that did not rely on pressure, and he found himself assigned to a small work detail near the edge of the camp, where wooden boards were stacked in careful rows, their surfaces rough but uniform, and a British corporal stood nearby, explaining the task in slow, deliberate German, his words clear, his tone even, and Klaus listened without resistance, not because he had accepted his position, but because the explanation itself demanded attention, It was precise, respectful of understanding, and when the work began he followed the instructions exactly, measuring, aligning, adjusting, each motion deliberate, and the act of doing something simple, something physical, created a space in which observation continued without interruption, and he noticed how the corporal moved among them, not correcting loudly, not imposing, but observing, stepping in only when necessary, and when he did, his gestures were minimal, efficient, enough to guide but not to control, and Klaus found that this approach altered the way the men responded. There was no hesitation, no visible resistance, only participation, as if the structure itself invited cooperation rather than demanding it, and this realization settled, slowly, layering over the others that had come before, and as the hours passed the light shifted again, brighter now, the sky clearing slightly, and the camp took on a different tone, not louder, not faster, but more defined, shadows shortening, details sharper, and Klaus paused for a moment, straightening his back, his hands resting at his sides, and he looked across the yard where another group was working near a line of vehicles, their movements coordinated, steady, and nearby Captain Edward Collins stood speaking with one of the British soldiers, his posture unchanged, his expression consistent, and when the conversation ended Collins turned slightly, his gaze moving across the area, not searching, not scanning, but aware, and for a brief second his eyes met Klaus's, and there was no shift in his expression, no reaction beyond recognition, and yet that moment held weight, because it confirmed something Klaus had begun to understand, that within this place he was seen not as an enemy to be managed, but as a person within a system that expected something different from him, something quieter, something internal, and Klaus returned his attention to the work, but the awareness remained, and it influenced the way he moved, the way he measured, the way he aligned each board, not with urgency, not with resistance, but with a growing sense that the act itself mattered, not for outcome, but for what it represented. And as the task continued, he heard a sound from beyond the fence, faint at first, then clearer, the distant laughter of children, carried on the breeze from somewhere outside the camp. And he looked up, his gaze drawn outward, and for a moment he could see them through a gap in the trees, small figures moving across an open field, their motion unstructured, their voices uncontained, and the contrast between that freedom and the ordered space of the camp did not create tension, it created perspective. And Klaus felt that perspective settle into him, not as comparison, but as context, and he understood then that the world beyond this place continued in ways that were not defined by what happened here, and that realization did not diminish his situation, it clarified it. And as the sound faded and the work resumed its steady rhythm, he returned to the task with the same measured focus, but now accompanied by something else, something quieter, a recognition that the boundaries around him did not define the entirety of his experience, and that within those boundaries there was still room for understanding. And as the midday light held steady and the hours moved forward without disruption, Klaus Reinhardt continued to observe, to adjust, and to allow the accumulation of these moments to reshape something deeper than expectation, something that had once been fixed and was now, slowly, becoming something else entirely. The afternoon did not break into anything dramatic, it simply continued, and that continuity had begun to carry its own weight as Klaus Reinhardt moved through the remaining hours of the day, his hands still working with the wood, aligning edges, adjusting angles, repeating motions that had become familiar in their simplicity, and yet within that repetition something had changed, not in the task itself, but in the way he engaged with it. The absence of resistance no longer something he questioned, but something he recognized, and as the sun lowered, slightly, casting longer shadows across the yard, the pace of the work did not increase or slow. It remained consistent, as if unaffected by time, and that steadiness drew his attention again to the structure that held everything in place, a structure that did not rely on pressure, that did not announce itself, but was present in every detail, in the spacing of the buildings, in the rhythm of movement, in the way voices remained low even when no one was listening closely. And Klaus paused, briefly, straightening, his gaze moving across the camp once more, and he saw Captain Edward Collins again, standing near the central path, speaking with another officer, their posture relaxed but precise, their conversation measured, and when it ended Collins turned slightly, his eyes moving across the yard, not searching, not assessing in the way Klaus had once been trained to do, but simply observing, aware of everything without focusing on any one thing. And for a moment that awareness felt unfamiliar to Klaus, because it suggested a form of control that did not require constant adjustment, a form of leadership that existed without visible assertion, and he returned to his work, but the thought remained, settling into the growing pattern of understanding that had been forming since his arrival. And as the task neared completion, the corporal approached, looking over the finished rows of boards, his eyes moving slowly, taking in the details, and when he reached Klaus he stopped, examining the alignment, the spacing, and then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and moved on without comment. And that single nod carried more weight than any spoken approval could have, because it confirmed something without emphasizing it. And Klaus felt that confirmation register quietly, not as pride, not as satisfaction, but as recognition that the work had been understood. And as the group began to disperse, the tools returned to their place, the boards stacked neatly. Klaus stepped back, his hands resting briefly at his sides, and he looked again toward the fence, toward the distant line of trees and the suggestion of the town beyond, and the sound of movement carried faintly on the air, not distinct, not defined, but present, and he realized that the separation between this place and that world was not absolute. It was defined, but it was not isolating, and that realization shifted something in the way he perceived his surroundings, not as confinement, but as a different kind of space, one that operated according to its own principles. And as he began to walk back toward the barracks, the light continued to soften, the sky taking on a deeper tone, and the camp adjusted to the change without disruption, the same steady rhythm continuing. And he passed by the central path where Collins stood again, now alone, his posture unchanged, his presence consistent, and as Klaus approached their eyes met. Briefly, and this time Klaus did not look away immediately, not out of defiance, but out of acknowledgement. And Collins returned the look with the same calm neutrality, and then nodded slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, and Klaus inclined his head in return, the motion equally restrained, and in that exchange there was no tension, no unspoken conflict, only recognition, and Klaus continued on, entering the barracks. As the interior light shifted to match the fading day, the space familiar now in its simplicity, and he moved to his bed, sitting down with the same controlled motion, but the control itself had changed, less rigid, more natural, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze moving across the room, taking in the presence of the others, each man quiet, each absorbed in his own thoughts, and the silence was no longer something that needed to be filled. It had become part of the environment, part of the structure that allowed everything else to exist without strain, and Klaus closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to register the day as it had unfolded, not through events, but through details, through the accumulation of moments that had reshaped his understanding without forcing it. And when he opened them again, the room had darkened further, the outlines softer, the sounds quieter, and he understood then that the shift he had been experiencing was not temporary, it was not a reaction to a single moment. It was a process, gradual, steady, and that process would continue, not because it was imposed, but because it was inevitable. And as the evening settled fully and the camp moved once again into its quiet rhythm, Klaus Reinhardt remained still, aware, and for the first time since his arrival, he did not search for what was wrong. He simply observed what was there, and in that observation he found something that could not be dismissed, something that did not require explanation to exist. And that was enough to hold his attention as the day came to its quiet. In the night passed without interruption, and when Klaus Reinhardt opened his eyes again, the transition from darkness to light felt less like a shift and more like a continuation, as if the hours in between had simply carried the same quiet rhythm forward. And he remained lying still for a moment, his gaze resting on the ceiling where the early light began to trace faint lines along the wood, and he noticed how his breathing matched the stillness around him. Steady, unforced, and that awareness itself marked a change, because it was no longer shaped by anticipation or tension, it simply existed, and he sat up slowly, the motion familiar, but now accompanied by a clarity that had not been present before. and as his feet touched the floor he did not pause to question what the day would bring, because he had begun to understand that the day would unfold as the previous ones had, not through disruption, but through continuity, and he stood and moved toward the window once more, his steps quiet, his posture composed, and outside the camp had already begun its steady motion, the same pattern repeating, soldiers moving along the paths, the gravel shifting softly beneath their boots, the air cool and consistent, and beyond the fence the distant town showed the first signs of activity, a door opening, a figure stepping out, the small details of a life continuing without awareness of the boundary that separated it from this place. And Klaus watched this for a moment, not searching for meaning, but allowing it to exist as part of what he was beginning to understand, and he turned as the door opened behind him, the familiar voice announcing breakfast in the same calm tone, and the men moved. Without hesitation, forming the same loose line, and Klaus followed, stepping outside into the morning air, the sensation now expected, the environment no longer unfamiliar, and as he walked toward the mess hall he realized that the absence of uncertainty had replaced the need for preparation, and that shift allowed his attention to settle more fully on what was in front of him, and inside the building the same arrangement greeted him, the same order, the same quiet efficiency, and he took his tray, the motions now instinctive, and sat, beginning to eat without the pause that had marked his first day. And across the room Captain Edward Collins stood again near the entrance, his presence unchanged, but this time Klaus noticed something he had not fully recognized before, not in Collins himself, but in the way others responded to him, the absence of tension, the ease with which his presence integrated into the space. And Klaus realized that this was not a result of authority alone. It was something else, something that did not need to be asserted because it was already understood, and that understanding extended beyond Collins, beyond the soldiers, into the structure of the place itself. And as he finished the meal and stepped outside once more the realization continued to settle, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition that the system he was within operated on principles that did not require force to be effective. And that recognition shifted the way he moved through the day, the way he approached the work that followed, the way he observed the interactions around him. And as he joined the work detail again, taking his place among the others, he noticed how his own actions had changed. The precision remained, the discipline remained, but the tension had faded, replaced by a steadiness that aligned with the rhythm of the camp. And as the hours passed, he no longer measured time in anticipation of what would come next. He experienced it in the continuity of what was already present, and that continuity allowed something else to emerge, a quiet sense of clarity that did not demand answers, but accepted the presence of questions. And as he paused briefly, looking across the yard, his gaze falling once more on Captain Edward Collins standing near the central path, he understood that the difference between them was no longer defined solely by position or by past, but by the way each of them existed within this space. And that understanding did not create conflict. It created perspective, and Klaus felt that perspective settle into him with a calm certainty, not as a resolution, but as a foundation for something that was still unfolding. And as the day continued in its steady rhythm, unchanged and uninterrupted, he realized that the transformation he had begun to experience was not something imposed upon him. It was something he was allowing, something that grew from observation, from recognition, from the simple act of seeing what was there without resistance. And in that realization there was no urgency, no need to define it, only the quiet awareness that it was happening, and that it would continue, as inevitably as the light moved across the sky and the camp carried on in its measured, unbroken rhythm. The pattern did not break, and that was the moment Klaus Reinhardt understood that it would not. Not because it could not, but because it did not need to. And that realization came quietly as he stood once more near the edge of the yard, the midday light settling evenly across the camp, the shadows short, the air still, and everything moved with the same measured continuity that had defined each hour since his arrival. And he found himself no longer searching for differences, no longer measuring what he saw against what he had believed, because the comparison itself had begun to lose its relevance, replaced by something more direct, something grounded in what was present rather than what had been expected. And he watched as a group of prisoners crossed the yard carrying tools, their movements aligned without instruction, their pace steady. And a British soldier walked beside them, not guiding, not correcting, simply present, and the absence of tension in that movement no longer felt unusual. It felt consistent, and Klaus realized that consistency was the defining feature of this place. Not the absence of conflict, not the presence of order, but the reliability of how everything unfolded. And that reliability had begun to shape his own perception, allowing him to move through the day without resistance, without the need to anticipate what might come next. And as he turned slightly, he saw Captain Edward Collins again, standing near the central path, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. And this time Klaus did not observe him as an officer, did not measure him against rank or authority. He saw him as part of the same structure, a figure whose role was to maintain balance rather than impose control. And that distinction settled clearly now, no longer an observation but an understanding. And Klaus felt the weight of that understanding not as a burden, but as a release from the need to interpret everything through the framework he had carried before. And as the afternoon progressed, the work continued, the same tasks, the same rhythm, and Klaus moved through them with a clarity that had not been present in the beginning. His actions aligned with the structure around him, not forced into it, but integrated within it. And that integration did not diminish him. It defined his place within the moment. And as he paused again, his gaze moving beyond the fence toward the distant line of trees and the suggestion of the town beyond, he realized that the boundary he had once perceived as limiting was simply a definition of space, not a definition of experience. And that realization shifted something deeper, something that extended beyond the physical environment into the way he understood his own position. And he stood there for a moment longer, his posture steady, his expression composed, and allowed that understanding to settle fully. And as he turned back toward the center of the camp, he saw a small interaction unfold near one of the buildings. A prisoner speaking with a British soldier, their exchange brief, their gestures minimal, and when it ended both men moved on without hesitation, without any sign of tension, and that simplicity carried more meaning than any prolonged conversation could have, because it reflected the same underlying principle that defined everything here, a principle that did not require explanation, only presence. And Klaus continued walking, his steps measured, his attention focused not on what was missing, but on what was there. And he understood then that the process he had been experiencing was no longer unfolding in fragments. It had reached a point where the pattern was clear, where the accumulation of moments had formed something cohesive, something that could not be dismissed or reduced. And that realization did not bring closure, it brought clarity, and in that clarity there was a quiet acceptance, not of circumstance, but of reality. And as the light began to shift again toward evening, the sky deepening, the shadows lengthening, the camp adjusted without disruption, the same rhythm continuing, and Klaus returned to the barracks once more, the space familiar, the environment unchanged, and he sat on his bed with the same controlled motion. But now the control felt natural, aligned with the steady pace of everything around him, and he leaned back, slightly, his gaze resting on the ceiling as the light faded, and he allowed the day to settle into memory, not as a sequence of events, but as a continuous experience. And in that experience he recognized something that had not been present before, a sense that what he was witnessing was not simply different from what he had expected, it was fundamentally incompatible with it. And that incompatibility did not create conflict, it created transformation. And as the room grew darker and the sounds of the camp softened into the quiet rhythm of night, Klaus Reinhardt understood that the change within him was no longer tentative. It was established, and it would continue, not because it was forced, but because it had become the only way to reconcile what he had seen with what he now knew to be true. The night settled once more with the same quiet certainty, the kind that no longer needed to announce itself. And Klaus Reinhardt lay still for a moment before rising, not because anything required him to, but because the rhythm of the place had already become part of him. And when he stood, the movement felt natural, unforced, as if it belonged to the same structure that surrounded him. And he walked toward the window for what would not be the last time, but felt like a final time, his steps measured, his posture steady. And outside the camp existed exactly as it had before, the lanterns casting soft light along the paths, the silhouettes of soldiers moving without urgency, the distant outline of the town beyond the fence holding its quiet presence, and nothing demanded attention, nothing disrupted the balance. Everything remained as it was, and that sameness no longer carried contradiction. It carried meaning, and Klaus stood there longer than usual, his gaze not searching, not questioning, simply observing. And in that observation, he understood something that had been forming across every hour since his arrival, something that had not been spoken, not explained, but had revealed itself through consistency, through detail, through the absence of what he had expected to find. And he realized that the most profound shift had not been in what he saw, but in how he saw it, because the world in front of him had not changed. It had always been this way, steady, structured, grounded in something that did not require force to exist, and it was his perception that had been incomplete, shaped by narratives that could not survive direct observation. And that realization settled fully now, without resistance, without the need to reconcile it with anything that came before. And he turned slightly as the door opened behind him. Captain Edward Collins stepping inside once more, his presence unchanged, his movements consistent. And for a moment they stood within the same space, neither speaking, neither needing to, and Collins inclined his head slightly. The same restrained gesture as before, and Klaus returned it, the motion equally measured. And in that exchange there was no longer distance. Not because their roles had changed, but because the meaning of those roles had been redefined. And Collins moved on, his steps quiet, his presence continuing through the room as it always had. And Klaus remained where he was for a moment longer before turning back to his bed, sitting down. With the same controlled motion that had marked every action. But now the control was not something he held on to. It was something that aligned with everything around him. And he leaned back slightly, his gaze moving once more across the room, taking in the quiet presence of the others, the steady rhythm of breath, the absence of tension. And he understood then that what he had experienced here was not a moment of exception. It was a reflection of something larger, something that extended beyond the boundaries of the camp, beyond the roles assigned within it, something that defined how a system could function without reducing the people within it. And that understanding did not erase what had come before, it placed it into context, and in that context there was no need for judgment, only recognition. And as the light outside continued to fade and the room settled into darkness, Klaus closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement of the process that had unfolded. And when he opened them again, the outlines of the room were softer, the sounds quieter, and the sense of clarity remained, steady, unchanged. And he realized that there would be no single moment that marked the end of this understanding, no clear point of conclusion, because what he had begun to see would continue beyond this place, beyond this time, carried not as a lesson imposed, but as something observed and accepted. And as he lay back, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed, he no longer held on to the need to define what this meant, because the meaning was already present in everything he had seen, in every quiet moment, in every measured action, in every absence of what he had expected, and that was enough. And as the camp moved into the stillness of night once more, unchanged, uninterrupted, Klaus Reinhardt understood that the world he had stepped into had not revealed itself through force or declaration, but through something far more enduring, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And in that understanding there was a quiet certainty, one that did not demand attention, but remained steady and undeniable long after the moment itself had passed.